I'm excited to be here today with our panelists to talk about water and forests and taking some of the traditional challenges and turning those into opportunities that benefit not only the environment but also the economy. So it's great to find those win-win opportunities, and chatting with these panelists here just prior to beginning this. It should definitely be an interesting conversation with some great perspectives to share. So looking forward to it. So I have to my left Laurie Wayburn. Laurie is the co-founder, co-CEO, and president of the Pacific Forest Trust. And to her left is Maida Loftsgaarden. She's the executive director of the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, or OWEB. And then on the end is Neal Ewald, who's Chief Operating Officer and Senior Vice President of Green Diamond Resource Company. Their full bios are in the materials if you want to take a deeper look. And we have, Laurie suggested yesterday that they sort of represent the three legs of a stool. We have the private sector with Neal, the nonprofit sector with Laurie, and Maida representing the public sector. So I will let them briefly introduce sort of a little more about themselves and their organizations, and then we'll take it from there.
Good morning. So my organization, the Pacific Forest Trust, is a think and do organization that is focused on conserving forests for all their values, working with landowners and communities to do that. We've conserved about 285,000 acres in California and Oregon, and our main focus is to find sources of return for landowners that are compatible with sustainable forestry. So climate services, water services, wildlife services, all while maintaining these working forests.
And I'm Maida Loftsgaarden, and I wear two hats for this conversation today. First is the executive director of the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, which is actually a state agency, though the name does not sound like that. Our job is to invest about 7.5% of the state's lottery funds, along with federal dollars, for a biennial investment of about $100 million in native fish and wildlife habitat and water quality projects. So we fund some of the work that Pacific Forest Trust is helping to implement in our state. So that really connects well with the voluntary work that we want to do around habitat and water quality. At the same time, over the last 6 months, I've had the opportunity to serve as the lead for Oregon's 100-year water vision, which is a comprehensive approach to looking at our state's water system, natural infrastructure, which includes forests and farmlands and other systems that water flows through before it comes to communities, and then the investments we need to do in our communities, all the way out to the ocean to really protect our communities, to take care of the environment, to take care of and grow our economy, to look at safety, and also to look at community development.
Great. So again, my name is Neal Ewald, the Chief Operating Officer at Green Diamond Resource Company. We're a 129-year-old family company, operated with the fifth generation of family continuous management. My background is having been in California for more than 40 years, recently into this job in January. But Green Diamond has been on a bit of a growth surge. We now have 1.8 million acres across the United States, largely in the West, a 500,000 acre management obligation in 5 states in the South. Our home state is the state of Washington, where we have 300,000 acres of Douglas fir forest under management. My background, again, in California, we have 400,000 acres of redwood and Douglas fir lands there, and more pertinent to this discussion, 600,000 acres in Oregon and around Klamath Falls. And maybe the most appropriate and germane thing to end this comment with is the notion that, in spite of being 129 years old, we seem to reinvent ourselves routinely. Maybe I could see if the fates conspire to allow me to finish this. Given the nature of this panel today, what's unique, I think, about Green Diamond, in spite of being 129 years old, is our willingness to reinvent ourselves. And so over the years, we have adopted habitat conservation plans as a way to manage in the long term, with these long-term 30 to 50-year permits to give us certainty and outcomes. And we've adopted a conservation easement model to put significant lands under prohibition for development. And then finally, I think we have, Laurie, you can correct me on this, I think we may have 2 of the largest carbon projects in the country. Those happen to be here in the state of Oregon. So, on to you.
Great. So we're talking about water and forests, but why water and forests, and what's the nexus between those two that makes it so interesting? So Laurie, I'll let you start on that.
Well, really, the nexus between water and forests is integral. Without forests, we don't have our water supply, whether you're on the west side or the east side. Those who live on the west side, you know that forests capture about 25% more precipitation than if you didn't have forests, and that makes it absolutely essential for people's water supply. They cool the water. If you're a fisherman, it's absolutely essential to know that the forests are working well to maintain that. If you're on the east side, you know that your water comes from your forested watersheds. And so the relationship here is absolutely that these things go together. And people think of the tree of life, you might think of it as the tree of water from that point of view. So when we look at the impact of how we both conserve and manage our forests, we're actually looking at our future water supply. And that is something that in most people's mind, they think of forests, yeah, timber. I mean, I happen to be somebody who adores really good wood. I have a house with good wood, and I love it. But really, the most important thing, perhaps, that forests deliver for us is cool, clean water.
Mita, why don't you go ahead?
All right, so I'll add to that. I think, Laurie, you worded it very well. And when we think about Oregon's 100-year water vision, and we think about a secure and resilient water system for Oregon's future, we're thinking 100 years out because the impacts of what we've built in our infrastructure over the last 100 years has put us in this spot. So we have vastly underinvested in our water infrastructure, and our traditional water infrastructure, because we're humans and we like to build things, is a system of pipes. It's a system of canals. It's a very built system. And I think one of the opportunities that we have as we now look 100 years forward is to really think about what nature has been doing for hundreds of millions of years and returning to those systems that are actually less expensive from an economic perspective. It is much cheaper to work with a sustainable timber company who wants to invest in the public values of water to keep that water cool and keep it clean longer through the system so that we spend less money on cooling and cleaning that water through a built infrastructure system. And I'll give an example just right outside of town here, and this is a little bit more on the agriculture side. Clean Water Services had a need to build a $10 million cooling facility in order to meet the regulatory requirements for that community. Instead, they partnered with farmers upstream to plant trees in riparian areas and spent $3 million instead of $10 million working with sustainable farmers right upstream from their system to get that water to the same place. Oregon is really blessed to have the extensive forest systems that it has, but we're not intentionally recognizing the value that those provide for our surface water that comes to communities, that makes places like Portland a great place to live. We can really do more to make sure that we are intentionally recognizing the public values that our forests provide.
Well, I was thinking about the notion of nexus as it relates to forestry and industrial forestry, and in particular, I think we're arrayed here because we're not satisfied with the outcome, or we think in the future we won't be. And so when you look at the watersheds that produce most of the water in the state of Oregon, most of them are forested, and most of those forests are actively managed. So we have an opportunity to look ahead and try to create some sort of market-based incentive system to get ahead of the game, to incent people to do things who are actively managing forests every day. And so if we can take a slightly different perspective to offer a carrot well before a stick is needed, that's really a fascinating premise to me, and that's one of the reasons I'm here, is to talk more about that.
And that sort of leads me into the next question here for you, which is, is what's happening right now that's really driving the need for sort of changing the status quo, and what's the desired outcome in the future? And Maida, I'll let you start on that.
There's a lot packed into that question. So I think from my perspective, I'll say one of the challenges of what's happening right now is states, Oregon included, tend to be very focused on what's going on inside our state. And you look south, and I really appreciate having Laurie because she's from there and she understands what's going on in our neighboring state that has had considerable issues with drought for many years. And we hear it on the national news and we say, boy, that's rough for California. we're right across that border. And I think the challenge that we have in Oregon, and the thing that we really want to address, is there's this assumption that Oregon is a water-rich state. And you see that we have almond growers from California who are moving up here and buying hazelnut operations because there's more water available here. Hazelnuts are traditionally a dryland crop. They're moving up here and now irrigating that dryland crop, which means we're using more water because we have folks who are very traditionally used to using water. And there's an assumption that Oregon is a water-rich state. If you go to the east side of Oregon, we have never been a water-rich state. If you look at precipitation around 7 to 10 inches in some of our high desert areas, we are living on borrowed time. And if we look to our neighbors to the south, we can see what our future might be. Our hope and the opportunity that we're looking for is to act now, so that we have this space in time where we can partner with timber landowners, with farm landowners, and others to really shift how we think about water, how we connect ourselves to our watersheds in a different way. And I think we're sitting in a really unique space where we can see what's coming, but we have an opportunity now to really act and to put a specific value on those services that our forest landowners are providing to us, who are taking care of that water, whether it's federal forest lands, so Bull Run is a federal forest land surrounded system that's providing water to all of us here today, making sure that we're really paying attention to that. And I think, again, this is a chance where we can get ahead of it and really invest intentionally in partnership with our timber landowners.
Laurie, why don't you provide your perspective on this, please?
Sure. Well, one of the things about now is that we recognize we are in an accelerating phase of climate change. And one way to think about climate change is it's speeding up time. So Meta talks about the drought in California. In the year 2080, the climate in Portland will be that of San Jose, California, if climate change continues on the track that we're on. So you can look south and see time speed up and make some choices. So I think that what's different now is we know that summers are longer, they're hotter in Oregon. Species that we relied on, like Douglas fir, don't like that. Hemlock's a little bit better, but you can't just replace one with the other and expect to go on as if everything were the same. So what's different about now is also that we have the technology that enables us to look across time and space differently. Some of us may not like computers because they rule our lives in ways we may not want, but then again, they also are helpful. So the choices that we have right now are to look at the information and to feel the way life is changing around us and say, what can we do about that? So you take the opportunity of the 100-year water vision and you say, I can actually see that, and I can make some choices. You take another point here, which is that as human beings, we've come to realize the fruits of our own labor. We value our labor, so we value our built infrastructure. But what nature has given us, we take for free. And when we realize that that natural infrastructure is the essential partner to the built infrastructure that gives us water, and it is also the natural infrastructure that gives our fish and our wildlife water and makes our land productive, we have the choice right now to recognize those things, take the water vision, and integrate those into a new system that values forests for the water that they provide. So that is what I think is different about now.
Neal, do you have anything to add?
Yes, well, this is an exciting question for me. As I look back on other issues the forest industry has faced, and just the spotted owl's example, we didn't know very much about it. In fact, that's one of the reasons it was a listed species, is because of the lack of information. And so what's important now is to get ahead of the crisis, to begin to collect data and understand how what we do in the woods is active management we're doing every day. What does that do? How does that create, what I'm hearing now is more of a conversation about water yield. We've dealt with water quality for a long, long time. We've treated water quality as from the perspective that logging is bad, and the further away you can get logging from the things you care about, the better off you are. And so we've moved into the buffer space, if you will, for water quality. And I think it's more important than that. We've learned since that view that logging roads are perhaps the most important detriment to water quality in the field. So let's learn the lesson now before the crisis is upon us. And as we learn the lesson, let's try to figure out what it is we're trying to achieve in terms of management outcomes that can turn into the real tangible things that we're trying to acquire, which is, I think now, this debate about how we acquire more water yield in addition to water quality.
So you sort of touched on it, but as landowners or land managers, what are some steps that can be taken to reach some of these outcomes that we've discussed?
Well, yes. I think if you were to array 100 scientists in a room and ask them their opinion about how to increase water yield, you probably get 110 opinions. And so I think the first thing we can do is try to figure out what really works. And this is, unfortunately, it became the burden of many landowners, particularly in California, to prove we weren't guilty, if you will, with some of these practices. And so we've spent a lot of time and energy over the last couple decades. I like to claim we have more scientists per acre in California than anywhere else in the world, just collecting monitoring and data, because we have an adaptive management plan. And so we can't be arrogant enough to think that even if we come up with a solution out of the box, that it's going to preside forever, particularly in the midst of changing climate. So I think what we can do now, one of the things we can change is maybe ask government to array scientists and put some money in finding out what really works. And there's a number of experimental forests around, and we had a debate earlier today whether that really works. But I believe even in a stochastic environment where climate is changing, you can still get a better idea of how effective management regimes are if you've put it to the rigor of the scientific method.
And Meta, from your perspective, what is it that landowners and land managers can do?
I think there's a mix of things, and Teen, right off of what Neal was saying, I think one of the opportunities that we have when we think about water and we think about our water future, there is a changing climate, no question. When we, and again, I'm going to contrast that built and natural infrastructure. When we build things, we expect and need them to last for 50 or 75 years. Some of the infrastructure that we're dealing with now is 100 years old, probably had a shelf life of 50 years. But as we think about building things, they're going to look the same for the next 50, 75, 100 years. When we work with our forest lands, we have this great opportunity to adaptively manage. And so this is the source of our water is our forest lands. That's where it hits the top of Mount Hood. It's coming through forest lands before it comes down to us in nearly every part of the state other than high desert in far eastern Oregon. Our forest lands are what's holding that water. And by working with our landowners, by incentivizing, by standing side by side with them, using science, using monitoring to say, okay, well, this didn't quite work, but maybe in your next harvest, could we think about maybe doing this instead and treating that forest system like the sponge that it is to hold that water longer. That's a very different conversation. We were talking with somebody from the city of Eugene a few weeks ago. They have 200 miles of wastewater pipes. They are replacing them at 2 miles a year, so that means 100 years. They are replacing them with the same system. So 100 years from now, we are going to have a system that looks identical to the system we have now, but we have climate change that is going to be a great impact. We have a real need to conserve water, and that impacts how those built systems work. It's much easier to work with our private lands partners, with the Forest Service, with state lands and others, to really think about how we adaptively manage. I think there's a much bigger opportunity, especially in the way that Oregonians think. We talk about the Oregon way. That we do these kinds of things in partnership, and we just have a lot more flexibility to work collaboratively with landowners.
Laurie?
Well, one of the really interesting things here is that people live a relatively short time as individuals as compared to forests. And a challenge for a landowner often is they have a financial return target they need to meet. Sometimes it's actually even quarterly even at this point. And when you think about 25 years ago, the average age of rotation for forests in Oregon was 80 years. That's a big change. So when we think about what we can do with landowners and forests and water, one thing is we know we're going to need water forever. So we're going to need those forests forever. But one of the critical things as a forest landowner is a big way you can make money is by turning your forest into something else. So a challenge for a landowner is, how do I get financial return for making the decision to keep my forest as forest? Still managing it, but that's a challenge. And so on the side that we're looking at here, as the public and as people who use water, is how do we compensate landowners for making that decision to keep forests as forests, because we're going to need water forever. And even under climate change, these systems are going to be the ones where we get our water from. I mean, forests are really interesting. They provide at least 5 critical water services. Number one, they attract water. The shape of forests and the existence of forests is something that holds clouds and milks precipitation from clouds. So it's a water attractant, whether it's water or snow. 2, it's a filtration system. It cleans things. 3, it's a collection system. It holds water, pulls it into the ground, releases it slowly. 4, it's a transportation system. And 5, it's your water quality cooling system. So, I mean, that's a whole lot to ask with no compensation. So big challenge for landowners is that long-term requirement, a lot longer than 25, 50, 75, or even 100 years. And so you want some kinds of agreements that are enduring, but that also have the flexibility to recognize that you may need some changes in how you're managing to maintain that forest system overall, so that it delivers water, amongst other things.
So we've talked about these very complex systems here, and no small challenges of, figuring out how to manage our forest, adjust for climate change. Let's talk a little bit more about just some of these barriers to kind of reaching these goals, which are, as I said, and as you all have mentioned, not simple tasks to undertake. So, Neal, I don't know if you want to start in on sort of some of the barriers that you see in kind of getting where we want to be.
Yeah. Yes, I did. Well, I akin this a little bit to the carbon issue some years ago. In fact, I was quoted, I think in 2010, of saying, geez, I don't think this is going to amount to any much at all. And here we are with 2 very large projects. But I think the issue at the time was, well, how do we do it? What are the rules? And what are we trying to achieve? And then even if we agree on what we want, how do we get there? And so I think the biggest barrier is to decide how to create the market, and then how to define it. It's a very complicated system. Again, we were talking here before we started about how you would even measure outcomes at the end of your watershed, at the end of a pipe somewhere, or an entrance to some treating facility. Who decides that what you've done works? And so I think getting on with trying to figure that out and get some sort of common metric as to what we can then begin to experiment with, because again, we should not be arrogant enough to think just because smart people in a room come up with an idea, it's really an effective one. So I'm excited to get that done now, because here it is, almost halfway through. I don't think we talked about regulation yet, and I just want to, in case I miss my chance to say this, again, it was earlier today, someone mentioned the notion that once a regulation gets in place, it's extraordinarily hard to change. It has a lot of inertia. And so to the extent that we can provide a regulatory or a non-regulatory environment that it creates incentives, those are easy to change, because you can see right away that they're not working. But once we decide where that rigid line is on the ground, often it stays rigid because we forget about what we're trying to achieve. We just look at the enforcement side and the deployment side rather than the outcome.
Laurie, do you want to jump in?
Well, I love the fact that Neal brought up the carbon market, because my organization is the one that initiated this, starting within California and getting it incorporated into the regulatory system. And we did the very first carbon project that launched that system way back. But that said, we were looking at a commodity, a ton of carbon per year approach. And that's very similar to how we look at timber. It's a commodity. And I'm not sure that we can look at water as a commodity. You can look at riots all over the world when you try to treat it as a commodity, because water is a basic human right. The right to clean, drinkable water is a basic human right. So looking at this will require more than just a kind of commodity-based approach. And I think that's one of the really interesting things here that we're talking about. because it is not something that you can just kind of put in a box with that. So I absolutely agree that we want to have the flexibility in areas of specific management choices, but I also think that we want to have some enduring agreements here because of things that we know that we need and that will not change over time. And that is, for example, having watersheds as watersheds. The other thing I think we want to bring out here, and I know that Neal knows this well and Meta knows this well, and everybody in this room does, is that forests are not defined by one single thing. They're defined by the fact that they deliver a whole lot of stuff to us that we really rely on. Timber is one, and we've been paying for that for a long time. But water is about as critical as you can get, that along in climate stabilization. And I think one of the key challenges is finding the sweet spot here of what we want from forests and what we want landowners to do and how we pay landowners to do that, or how we reward them, because you can reward without simply being a check, although a check's awfully nice. I remember the very first check we got on our carbon project. It was 6 figures, and we were happy. The landowner for whom we managed was very happy indeed. So I think you want to look at this as having pieces that can change and pieces that don't change in terms of how landowners are working with the land to provide for water services, but underpinning it with how we're managing to maintain the forest writ large.
And Meta, yeah, I imagine you have some thoughts on this as well.
I do. I want to start with the specific conversation about kind of the regulatory incentive approach, and then I'm going to turn it over to you all, because there's more than just this conversation that's going on up here. So from our perspective, I think we fit in that space where we really do believe that there's good benefit to having a regulatory backstop that says this is the minimum that we expect in how our forest lands are managed. And that's for fish and wildlife, that's for water, that's to make sure that we're not spending more money when we go downstream on built infrastructure because we have sediment or other things in our system. So there's a need for a regulatory backstop. And it's not flexible, and it's not outcome-based, and it doesn't give us that opportunity to really work in partnership with those folks who are managing our lands. I think the challenge that we have is when you move to that incentive base, when you recognize that there's a public value for that water, we assume in Oregon, and probably not necessarily this room, but the folks who work really closely in the native fish and wildlife habitat world say, you know what, we funded the agency that I run now. We've checked the box. There's $100 million of biennium. If you can't get it all done with that, what are you doing? And I think we would say that $100 million of biennium does not come anywhere close to the needs that we have when we think about water in this state, which is where I then turn to you all, and I just would have you raise your hands, and we can't see much, but raise them anyway because it'd be fun. Raise your hands if you have employees or coworkers. Okay. Raise your hands if you would like them to stay where they are. And actually, I assume that you want to keep them where they are and keep them employed. It's a lot harder to hire new people, right, than it is to keep current people. Our employees want to live in a place that they have access to recreation, that they have access to good schools, that they have access to broadband, and fundamentally that they have access to water, right? And so if we're not working together with folks like Neal to make sure that we're taking care of our water, we are operating in a system that could look something like Flint, Michigan, where people don't necessarily want to go and have a good living wage and live in that community because they're not sure what their water's like. And again, we've been super lucky in Oregon that we say we haven't faced that issue, but if any of you know about Warm Springs, that lost its water for 2.5 months this last summer and had to have bottled water brought in for showers, for cooking. They had to close down their school. We are not far from that. And so I would say our biggest challenge is really less about the landowners and more about the fact that Oregonians are not paying enough attention to realize that we need to invest in this, that it's going to have to look different. If we want to continue to have clean water for our employees, clean water for our schools, available water for economic development, for the farms that feed us, That comes from taking care of and protecting our forest lands. And I think we really have to start shifting, just completely reimagining how we invest in this stuff. We're really good at investing in built stuff. We don't understand the amazing values that Laurie listed that we are not currently paying for.
And I'll just sort of a follow-up question on some of the comments you just made. I believe you're involved in kind of information gathering right now, meeting with people around the state related to the water vision, and I'm just curious to what extent some of these sort of concerns or thoughts have come up in those interactions.
Yeah, so what we've been doing on behalf of the governor's office for about the last 4 months is traveling around the state, meeting in communities from Ontario and LeGrand down to Medford, up here in the valley, Central Oregon, and on the coast, to talk about this concern about how do we think about water from a health perspective. So harmful algal blooms in Salem or on the coast. How do we think from an environmental perspective about our fish and wildlife and our natural infrastructure? How do we think from an economic perspective about having economic vitality continue in Oregon? And safety, floods, drought, fire. What we've found is for those people who've been paying attention to water, they see the issue and they see an urgency. And actually when we raise a 100-year water vision, they say, no, we have to act yesterday. And so there's this great tension between having a really long-term vision and the need to act now. We've had about interactions with about 600 people around the state who've been engaged and involved either in those conversations or in providing feedback in other ways. I would say the challenge that we have is we are a pretty big population state, and while having 600 people engaged in this conversation is amazing, that is 600 people in a very big state, and I think our biggest challenge is helping to expand that to help Oregonians across the state understand that need to act and move forward. And I think this is a place where Oregonians will, but we haven't moved ourselves past the people who already know the issue to the folks who really need to understand it, and you all are a great part of that.
So we've talked a fair amount now about some of these barriers to reaching the outcomes we would like to get, and Meta, you touched on sort of, sounds like an educational component to getting across those barriers, but I was hoping you all could expand a little on that, sort of how to get across these hurdles here, and Laurie, I'll let you take the lead on that.
How many people in this audience remember Pogo? It's a cartoon. Okay.
Not very
They're
many.
like a couple. It was old when I was young, but hey. Now, the biggest barrier to human action is human decision making. But I think that from a practical perspective, the endeavor that Meta is involved in with the water vision is extraordinarily helpful. The other way to get over these barriers is, to mix my metaphors, to make lemonade out of lemons. So everybody knows about the wildfires that we've been experiencing. And wildfires have a huge impact, obviously, on forests and water systems because of the increased sediment that happens and the change in the water regimes afterwards. So taking the opportunity on the upside of the water vision and taking the downside motivator of these fires, it's an opportunity to really engage Oregonians in this conversation directly. Because we're going to need to step up and provide the kind of money that makes the water vision a reality. And that's a lot of money. In the scheme of things, it's not, but when you look at it on paper and you say, well, $1 billion's not enough because we need at least $1 billion to get rid of the lead in the water fountains in our schools. Is $2 billion enough? Is $3 billion enough? That's a discussion that has to happen. But one of the key things that we can do, and this is something that gives me great hope, is Oregonians are very attached to land. It's a real, literal common ground across the state. And a key thing that we're talking about here is conserving and managing forest lands for water for people in the state. And there are some really critical tools that are inexpensive, relatively speaking, that help landowners maintain their lands and manage them well. Those are conservation easements. It's a tool that Meta's agency uses and funds a lot, along with cost share programs that help landowners do the right thing, because doing the right thing is an added cost on the land that they don't have the liquidity for. So there are really key actions that we can take to make the water vision a reality, that we can use to engage people proactively across the state in a way that supports our labor base and yields other forest products as well, and that supports other industries like fisheries. Because having cooler water in our upper watersheds means that the water coming out the mouth is cool, and that in 3 years we'll have a better age class of fish than we would have had otherwise when, like this year, there was warm water coming out. And fishermen are already saying, I was sitting next to one from Astoria saying, I don't know, in about 3 years we'll see that impact. It's not going to be good. So there's some very practical things that we can do that both take advantage of the positive momentum of the water vision, the kind of negative but very, very compelling impulse that comes from reaction to wildfires, and move ahead with some very practical tools such as conservation easements and cost-share investments.
Great, Neal, I think you've got the mic over there. If you want to add on that, and from the private, the private sector, sort of where you see, opportunities in getting across these hurdles.
Yeah, I think the biggest opportunity maybe have started today. I'm not sure that if you were to ask anyone in my business what they think about water, the first thing they would think about is water quality and how to manage it and what the regulations say and how many roads they're taking out of commission and so on. But we really haven't had a debate about, or any discussion really, about how to improve the quantity of water and what kind of water yields we could create. And so if you can have that discussion, I think then you need to get another barrier perhaps is to understand what do you want it for. And so it seems like we've been talking about uses for people, drinking water and so on, but there's a big constituency out there that we've been dealing with a long time, and those are the fisheries folks. And so, in fact, how many dams have been removed for that purpose over the years, where water was available for use for domestic consumption, and now it's used for a different purpose, arguably. So I think one of the barriers is to try to figure out what it is that we want, and then start thinking about how to achieve it in ways that are sort of free the anxiety of how much it's going to cost me. As Laurie said, the first check was 6 figures. Well, I'd be happy with 5 figures for the first check if we could figure out how to put some incentive-based system in the environment. But I just don't think we're engaged. And so it's interesting. I think we haven't used this word. It's perhaps a buzzword, ecosystem services, but what do we provide that's beyond just the timber commodity that comes off forests? We've been trying to fragment that and take advantage of doing things other than traditional forest managers have done over the years. And so maybe there's ways for us to get out ahead of that thinking. But I think in order to do that, we have to really have as clear an objective of what we're trying to achieve as we can. And I was going to say unfortunately, but I love diversity. The state of Oregon has many different kinds of forests. The Coastal Range, the Cascades, in and around the Klamath Falls area. Those are all different forests. They're going to have different outcomes and different ways to achieve that same kind of result. So you almost have to engage all of us and the university systems and have people start to do things to see what kind of outcomes are created, along with testing that against the forest managers to see what's practical. There's a great example of that in California. We used to argue about big old trees. Should we leave them or should we cut them? And it turns out that most of the big old trees are ugly and don't make a lot of good lumber. And the ones that aren't very ugly aren't very good for wildlife. So we eliminated a huge argument by scoring trees with their attributes for environmental benefits. And then the argument went away. So if we can find some low-hanging fruit early on, then maybe that can be a benefit that we can all enjoy before any of this even has to come to pass. If you could just do it for the benefit of it all, why wouldn't we? And I think you find a lot more forest managers are willing to do that sort of thing these days.
Maybe before you pass the mic there, just one question, for those of us that don't sort of deal in this world on a daily basis, maybe you could give just a couple practical examples. Maida gave the example working with, with farms of, planting vegetation along waterways, that sort of thing. And Laurie mentioned the conservation easements. And just what are some of the tools that you might use, if you could just sort of briefly describe.
Yeah. So, and again, my expertise in understanding forest management outcomes that would create more water yield are 42 years old from my forestry class back at Berkeley. So please bear with me. But I do remember that you can modify water yield by how forests are harvested. If you put shade on snowpacks, they last longer into the summer, as an example. And we just don't care. I mean, not that we wouldn't do it. It's just that it's not part of any of the decision making as it relates to how we operate in a forest. To a certain extent, that may get in the way of other regulations, And so, again, I think someone said earlier today, a young girl was asked, "Would you enter into this agreement for a long term?" And her answer was, "Well, no. What if it's wrong 20 years from now?" And so we have to be careful about that. But I really don't know, and maybe that's part of the issue, is that we haven't really turned our attention to what we would do and how we would do it in a practical sense in the forest. But every day, a chainsaw and a tree are engaged in the same space, and so there's plenty of opportunities for change if we were to figure out how to make that outcome that we want to look for.
Mayte, go ahead.
So Neal actually led into one of the things that I think as I look at opportunities, and there was a concept years ago when states were just being formed about how you set up the county system. And one of the pushes that I wish we had done that we didn't is a recommendation that in the West, states form their counties on watershed boundaries. So every one of us lives in a watershed. Just to get that off the record, there is no place on the face of the planet that is not ocean, that is not a watershed. We're either in the Willamette watershed, I live in the Clackamas watershed. It's the top of the ridge where the water flows down to the river. Every single part of that. Neal's property is a critical part of the watershed. What happened when we put our political boundaries in a space that does not reflect those is that then the political decision making is not tied to that, and our connection is not tied to that. So the Bull Run watershed is in Clackamas County, so I own Portland's water. And the choices that are made about how that county is managed are choices that are made by folks in Clackamas County. Luckily, in this area, we have Metro, and so we have a lot of conversations that run cross-county. So one of the things that I see is moving us past the barriers ties to the piece that Neal mentioned, and that is forest lands are different in all parts of the state. Our water challenges are different in all parts of the state. And we have an amazing opportunity to get super regional when we think about water. And I'll shift this over to transportation for a minute. We have a transportation investment system in Oregon that is a regional system. So folks in Burns can prioritize what they need in terms of sidewalks, in terms of bike lanes. Probably not a big mass transit at this point in time over there. They're not adding a max. They get a chance to prioritize those investments. And when we have our big transportation package, which we did back in 2017, those regional priorities get brought up to a state level, and Burns gets access, whereas if we had a statewide system, all that money would be coming here. It would be really hard for little communities to get connected, and their needs are different. We have to, while we talk about natural infrastructure and forest lands, we need to treat water infrastructure in the same manner. We need to get down to the regional level and say, what is it that we need in Portland, which is very different than what we need in Ashland, which is very different than what we need in Burns. So I'll just give a couple of examples. And when you look at Burns, it's generally a groundwater supplied community. They've tested their water. They are currently drawing from the ground water that is 1,000 to 6,000 years old. Now, from a marketing perspective, that's pretty cool. You can sell paleo water in San Francisco for $26 a gallon. From a sustainability perspective, that means that aquifer is not being recharged. We are pulling water that has been in the ground for 1,000 years. That's a very different issue than Bull Run in Portland, and how we make sure that we are managing our forest system so that we are not having the intense effects of fire that would really greatly impact that system. And it's very different than what's going on in Ashland, where they've taken a very strategic approach to actively managing their forest lands because they are a surface water source community. They have been able to shift people who are adamantly opposed to any type of timber harvest in that region to, they say now when folks wave at the logging trucks going by, they wave with all 5 fingers. because they understand that that forest management is helping to make sure that their drinking water is safe and provided for, and they get up into that system and they get to see what happens. That solution is very different than what's needed in a place like Lincoln City that can triple its population, I would guess, in the summer. So you have a very different water need in the winter than you do in the summer. If we can really focus regionally, I think what it does is engages folks like you all differently. When you really understand where your water comes from, you're more willing to invest with somebody like Neal because you get that that matters when you turn on the tap.
Did you have any final thoughts? It looked like you had one at one point.
Yeah, the diversity of forests is matched by the diversity of landowners. And, you have very small family forest landowners. Oregon has a lot of landowners who own 100 acres and less. And so the kinds of decisions they may make or want to make may well be different, and normally are different, than the kind of decision that Green Diamond will make with 600,000 acres. They may not be relying on timber as a commodity at all. They may simply have their lands as a heritage and family legacy, which the family that has Green Diamond also has. But the kinds of choices they can make about the type of management they can do are different, and the land type is different, and how they got the land. One of the big problems that Neal brought up from a water quality point of view is the heritage of roads that we have. And those roads got put in when people weren't really thinking about what the impact on sediment will be. And so that, when you used to be able to cross the river on the backs of the salmon, now you can cross on the back of the sediment that came from the roads that came to get the timber out and impacted things there. So I think that we have a tremendous opportunity for a flexible suite of choices underpinned by those kinds of choices that we aren't going to change, which is that we want to have the watershed there for the future. And so there's some things within here, as I say, that are long-term decisions that have to be made. And those are going to deal with maintaining the land base. We want to have some things which are flexible, which evolve with science and the landowners that are there. But we want to have that in a really productive dynamic. The tremendous thing that we have right now is the space and time to make that decision. We have the opportunity to do that. And it's tremendously exciting that the Water Vision is happening now. And that folks like you in the audience, you don't have to raise hands, but how many of you knew that the Water Vision process was happening? Because it's an extraordinary opportunity for all Oregonians to get involved and help ensure that for the next 100 years and the 100 years after that, our great, and truly great grandchildren have the kind of heritage that Oregon is famous for now.
So now we've talked a lot about forests and how sort of water fits into the forests and the nexus there. And I'm just wondering, we have folks in the audience from various sectors of the economy. We've got, food processors and folks in the industrial community. So just curious if you have some thoughts on, kind of both in the sense of the challenges, but also opportunities to sort of find these, win-win type opportunities. If you just have some thoughts you might share on that and how relevant all of this is to them as well.
So I might start, and I've got kind of two halves to this, and one is that opportunity just as a business yourself to take a look at what you want your water future to be. So when we think about food processing, when we think about beer and wine and cider, which I could talk about all day long because Oregon is amazing at that, and when we think about high tech and the need for water for cooling in the high tech industry, we are all big consumers of water. And so one of the things is, what do you want your water future to look like, both for your business, but also for the people that you employ and the community that you live in? So I would ask you all to think about that and how you can shift how you are using water. And then to really think about, are there ways that we supplement the kind of investments that are being made publicly, the kind of investments that are being made by timber owners themselves in this work, and really think about how the corporate community in Oregon can invest in this as well. You have a vested interest in making sure there is clean water for schools and clean water when you turn on your tap, and fish and wildlife habitat and recreational access. So what are the ways that we can start to form some really unique partnerships between the business community, the state, and our timber landowners to really invest in this work in a very different way?
Thank you. Well, I think everybody in this room, for the vast majority of their lives, takes water for granted. I know I did. I didn't mention this, but I was the president of a 20-home water company for 14 years because I kept being first at the meeting. And so I took, for a while, I did not take water for granted. And but if you turn the tap on and nothing comes out, that's one way for people to start paying attention. Let's hope we don't get there. But if you're a user of water, there may be a way for you to figure out how you can tap the consumers of that water downstream, not to use the metaphor that's turning into a pun, but the one thing we haven't talked about today, if there is an incentive-based system here, where does the money come from? Who's going to pay for that? Will someone be interested in buying some product because the water generated from that flowed from the slopes of Mount Hood or some place where the water was genuinely taken care of in a spectacular way? Who's going to pay for the BMPs, so to speak? If there is a trade-off, if it isn't just an equal trade-off between timber and water with no outcome to the other financial resources. So it'd be an interesting question to ask of the people who use this water. Is there any kind of market outcome or benefit that could come from someone who's doing it right? Our company in California is certified through FSC certification on the hope that the market system can give us an improvement in price because we've managed our forests in a different way. So how can you maybe take that idea to the marketplace and generate the income that's going to have to be in place before these incentive systems will really work?
I think one element of this is very transportable from whether it's forest land to agricultural or ranch lands. And that is, there is a public interest in how land is managed for water. And this is part and parcel of what the Water Vision is about, whether it's for the built infrastructure or the natural infrastructure. And I think the opportunity to bring communities together around working for the future for water, investing in restoring our landscapes for those water benefits, is a tremendous opportunity to bring Oregonians together across many, many different communities. So whether it's forest, whether it's rangeland, whether it's agricultural land, we actually know a fair bit about how to better manage these lands for their water values. And that's something that's highly compatible and brings people together across all economic and environmental sectors.
Great. Well, I think that is about our time, and I just want to say thank you to all of you for sharing your thoughts with us. And well, I think we're in a good place in that although we have lots of challenges ahead, there's a lot of discussion going on right now. I encourage all of you to get involved with the Water Vision and learn more about how this will affect you directly and what sort of opportunities and benefits you yourselves can create and find from all this. So thank you.